Hello, I'm Matthew Depner, and my presentation is Language Endangerment and Revitalization. Now, to give an idea of the scale of language endangerment, first it's important to note that it's expected that within the next century, half of all 6,000 to 7,000 languages on planet Earth are expected to lose all or most of all of their speakers, and that averages out about to one language every 2 weeks. Now, various endangerment scenarios are found all across the globe, but some of them can be quite serious. For example, a 2000 study of indigenous communities found that when a minority of the community identified as speakers of the heritage language, the suicide rate was 6 times higher than communities where the majority spoke the heritage language. Now, not all situations are this serious. However, I think it does give an idea of the stakes in some of the most heavily impacted communities. Now, looking at some of the recurring factors we see throughout language endangerment scenarios, I found that 5 were the most important for analysis. The first is geography, which of course can have an impact on the lifestyles people live in a community, such as are they a hunter-gatherer community, are they agrarian? This might not seem important, but it can impact the population sizes, and that can impact how they interact with other communities, and these context situations have a big impact on how language endangerment plays out. Now, another factor is cultural multilingualism. This is a sort of a coinage of my own for describing the degree to which it is accepted or expected that people in a community would know multiple languages. Now, another condition to consider is mobility. This can refer to both the physical mobility of people in a community to move around and come into contact with other people, but also it can refer to socioeconomic mobility and the ability to change class and thus also change sort of one's linguistic profile. Now, the last 2 factors sort of work together: community attitudes, the attitudes of speaker community towards their language, and institutional attitudes, the attitudes of institutions towards a language, where these institutions have a power over resources which can affect communities and the viability of their language within their sort of socioeconomic world. Now, these factors can form a helpful framework for categorization, and based on this framework for categorizing, I think they can be used in an evaluative mode and can help predict sort of how language endangerment scenarios might play out. Now, looking at language endangerment in Africa, we can sort of see aspects of social mobility and geography both at play. Interestingly, despite its colonial history, most often we find African languages replacing other African languages. This sort of has to do with mobility and the lack thereof in Africa. Although government and media often use colonial languages, a lack of mobility means people aren't really incentivized to use those languages, and it's fine to just use their indigenous languages and languages of heritage because it's not really going to impact whether they stay in their rural communities. Now, geography also impacts the sort of different types of subsistence patterns like hunter-gatherer versus pastoralist versus agrarian. And there's a great diversity in these subsistence patterns we can find in East Africa. For instance, the Maasai are pastoralists and the ASACs are hunter-gatherers. But historically, when a disease struck the cattle of the Maasai, they took refuge in ASACs communities. But being pastoralists, they had much greater numbers than the hunter-gathering ASACs. And so they essentially took over those communities and forced the Maasai language onto the ASACs due to their greater numbers, which was due to their lifestyle, which was sort of due to the geography which supported these various different lifestyles within Eastern Africa, allowing this context situation to take place. Now, moving into Asia, we can see good examples of cultural multilingualism due to many nations in Asia having both national languages and very notable regional languages which serve as lingua francas within their regions. In South Asia, we can see larger languages assimilating speakers from smaller languages. However, the larger language isn't always a national language. For instance, Assamese is a regional language which is expansive and within its particular corner of India. Now, in East and Southeast Asia, we can see similar dynamics for the languages in those parts of the continent. However, an interesting exception, it comes in the form of Japan and Korea, where their national standards are very pervasive to the detriment of any sort of other languages' vitality, regardless of any regional history. Now moving into Europe, we again see good examples of cultural multilingualism. This time, though, the national languages are so expansive, even notable regional languages are slowly being displaced. For instance, the national standard of Poland in Polish has displaced a regional language of historical importance known as Kashubian. Now, although a lot of these national standards are very high vitality languages in Europe, the Celtic languages, although being these historical languages identity in places like Ireland and Scotland and Wales, the Celtic languages have a lot of institutional support, very positive institutional attitudes, but they are really nowhere near as vital as English is in most people's daily lives in those places. Now, looking at Oceania, we can start to see very strong impacts of settlement colonialism. In Australia, there's a strongly monolingual English culture due to historically the arrival of colonial settlers introduced those colonial populations, while at the same time introducing epidemic disease, reducing indigenous populations, causing the colonial language of English to become deeply entrenched in this strongly monolingual culture. Now, the other parts of Oceania are generally much higher in diversity of language. Melanesia includes Papua New Guinea, which is infamously diverse linguistically speaking. Now, there are contact languages like Tok Pisin, which were born of contact between the indigenous languages and colonial languages. However, despite the expansion of such languages, Papua New Guinea and other parts of Melanesia are still very linguistically diverse. Now, similarly, Polynesia and Micronesia are also very linguistically diverse. However, historically, they have had larger units of political organizations, so individual languages usually cover larger amounts of physical territory, even though overall the regions are still very, very diverse. Now, New Zealand is a bit unlike some of the other regions, but more like Australia in its strong colonial history and having a large settler population due to that colonial history. However, it does also have a history wherein it adopted positive institutional attitudes towards its native language of Maori much earlier than other similar places like Australia or regions in the Americas. Now, moving into the Americas, we'll start with North America, which here will include Central America. Now, there's a mixed history with regards to whether missionaries have been hurtful or helpful. It really depends on where and who was involved. Different groups of missionaries affiliated with different countries took very different approaches. Some were very invested in preserving and documenting and understanding indigenous languages, and this was for the purpose of Bible translations. Other missionary groups expected the acculturation of the indigenous peoples to the colonial culture, and thus were not really eager to learn much about the indigenous languages. Now, in the United States and Canada, we can see pretty decidedly poor institutional attitudes in the existence of boarding schools, which indigenous children were sent to and were heavily punished for the usage of their indigenous languages. Now, in Canada, this was also affiliated with missionary work. However, the United States had a Bureau of Indian Affairs, which oversaw these institutions. Now, in Mexico and Central America, we sort of see the effect of geography, and that it worked out such that prior to colonization, this section of North America, Mexico and Central America, was the most densely populated region of the Americas at that time. And so there were still large communities of speakers, even post-colonial settlement. And so languages like Mayan have still very large absolute numbers in terms of the sizes of their communities of speakers of the language. And of course, this also helps create positive community attitudes due to a robust community. And Specifically, the Mayan languages in Guatemala are some of the best documented of indigenous languages of the Americas. Now, once again, we see a pattern of colonial settlement and epidemic disease. Again, a sort of geographic factor affecting the distribution of people across the areas. Now, also, we can see the poor effective institutional attitudes in that even after independence of these nations, they did not develop particularly good attitudes towards the treatment of indigenous peoples, and this had poor effects on their languages. For instance, the Ona people of Tierra del Fuego had their numbers reduced by headhunting activities, which were tacitly supported by the Chilean and Argentine governments. However, we can also see positive attitudes work to the benefit of the preservation of languages, and that the Jesuit missionaries had very good attitudes towards the indigenous languages, especially Guarani found in Paraguay. And this, among other factors, helped contribute to the fact that Guarani is today a very vital, well-spoken language that is not at all threatened. Quite exceptional within the Americas. Now, there are language endangerment scenarios on every continent, but not necessarily around every corner. So there's not necessarily something everyone can do about it. However, collectively, caring can cause politicians and scientists and other people who can do something about it to care when society at large sees it as an issue. Now, as for this research, it obviously doesn't solve anything, but it can be used to help build a framework for tackling the issue of language endangerment.